So listen to this. Back. In 2012, then Robin van Persie was Arsenal. That wasn't a team that was a one-man army. They had signed him 8 years earlier, hoping that one day he'd be able to fill the massive hole that will be left behind by a Dennis Bergkamp in that season. Even with the team in the gutter, he almost made it seem like the achievements of those two weren't so impressive after all. 39 goal contributions in a single Premier League season. Bergkamp never managed more than 27 and Henry. Well, not only did Van Persie match his goal-scoring record, but let's just say that, Evan, he'd been selfless enough to stop his run so that Henry could score on his comeback to Arsenal. That one extra goal would have allowed him to measure an Ollie to himself as the Premier League's all-time record goal scorer. I think you get the picture, but as good as he was then. It was the fact that he had stuck by his team through 6 long, trophyless years that made him their hero just a year before. Their captain says Cesc Fabregas had gotten so fed up with the situation the club was in that he offered to pay money out of his own pocket to leave. And once he did, it was Van Persie took on the armband all, while swearing to the fence that he would never do the same, claiming that my heart is with Arsenal. I couldn't even picture myself in a different shirt. I think we all know where this is going. Less than 2 months after scoring the final of those 30 goals, Robin van Persie refused to renew his contract at Arsenal and a month later not only at the left, yet sent for their rivals, stowing as far as claiming that the little boy inside me has always screamed for Man United. The fans came after his family. They burned shirts, the whole deal. It was one of the greatest betrayals in the history of the sport. But what hurt the most was that it paid off tremendously for both Van Persie and Man United. However, I always found it strange that people were so shocked that Van Persie would do such a thing because, for a player with so much glass with the ball, at his feet has always been problematic. Like, even when he was a kid, it was going off the rails. He always tells the story about how he got kicked out of glass so often that he became close friends with the janitor, and what's even more ridiculous than that is that his family never really cared because before he was even born, they went to a fortune teller because they wanted to know the gender of the baby, but not only did she confirm to his father that he finally have a son, but she told him that he would become a footballer and play for the Netherlands one day. So once he noticed that he had talent, he just accepted it was his destiny, pretty much led him to wherever he wanted, and that had some pretty clear consequences. When Van Persie was 16, as much as it was already, recognized as one of the best talents in the country, he'll literally get expelled from his Gloves Academy because, according to one of the coaches, he did nothing he was told and everything he wanted. Yeah, they got so annoyed at him that they would rather not have him in the team at all. In fact, according to many United chief scout back in, they were already looking at the possibility of signing him, but the stories they heard about his behavior at the club literally scared them away. Regardless, Feyenoord ended up signing him, and though they also worried about his lack of maturity after a series of injuries, they ended up being forced to bump him up to the first team way sooner than they expected, and the result was just wild. 8 months later, Van Persie was yet to score a single goal. However, it was a Dutch young, Talent of the Year and European champion. That seems almost like a paradox, I get it, but back then he was a traditional winner in a system with 2 strikers. So scoring goals wasn't exactly his job, but when it comes to everything else, he was a talent beyond his years. And just looking at that, he waved a cup run. He was the man of the match several times. Not only did he dominate both games against Rangers, being involved in 3 different goals, but even more impressive, then in the semi-finals he went against their defense looked like Swiss cheese. At Van Hooijdonk not wasted an open goal chance. It would have come out of there with 2 assists. So yeah, I think you can tell by now that it really was just a generational talent. In fact, Feyenoord would quick to make him sign a professional contract after all of that, but only 3 matches into the next season, he had already ruined everything. You see, they were about to play Real Madrid for the European Super Cup. Van Persie was obsessed with Zinedine Zidane. He wanted to play against him more than anything, but the game before that in Champions League playoffs, the coach told him to warm up and then didn't even bring him on, which in Van Persie's head meant that he would never get a chance to play in the Super Cup. So he lost his mind, and while most of his teammates Celebrated, he went into the locker room shouting in anger, throwing his boots on the ground, and the coach, knowing how much of a brat he could be, decided to punish him by repeatedly benching him and at times even sending him to play with the reserves. But the moment you let them play the full 90 for the first time since, scored 5 goals in a match. Then obviously they couldn't just keep mentioning him, and before he knew it, he was on 15 goals in 12 matches. But even after that, his form was as unstable as his temper, and as much as the fans already seemed sure that he became the next. Bergkamp, they also kind of hated him. He was so frequently arresting the streets that his father forced him to hire a bodyguard. But even though the club was as interested in selling him as he was interested in leaving, at that point, the other clubs had all caught up to the fact that he was trouble, so he was suck. And it was actually kind of strange how we got around that. You see, Arsene Wenger was one of the people, whether animal ready, but he thought that Van Persie wasn't ready to play in the Premier League, or as he said, to play in extreme conditions. But then Feyenoord sent Van Persie to play another match for the reserves. Who knows what he did that time? But once he got there, the Ajax were just crazy. They sped on him, they threw soft at him. He was abused the entire match, and somehow it still managed scar, which angered the rival fans so much that they rushed into the field and beat them up. I'm not even joking. After that match, as you might imagine, Arsene Wenger finally decided to sign him either out of sheer pity or because he now had confirmation that Van Persie really could handle extreme situations. But yeah, at Arsenal the plan was simple. Bergkamp and Henry, we were getting old. Anelka had left him, so they needed a new heir for the throne, and if Wenger had managed to turn Henry from a winger into the deadliest striker on the planet, he believed he could do the same to Van Persie. What he didn't realize was that he would make his job much harder than Henry had. Right on his first season, he was already getting slammed in the media for being immature. I mean, the Telegraph literally wrote that his brain serves no use. And if you're wondering what happened that time, well, in a match against Southampton, Van Persie was on a yellow card. So Arsene Wenger, knowing that he had that Balotelli gene, stopped him and told him, "Robin, be careful. Don't do anything stupid. Don't even make tackles." 5 minutes in, he lost the ball trying to dribble on the halfway line and proceeded to hit a Southampton player with a 2-footed tackle. As he walked off to the locker room, Wenger looked absolutely dumbfounded, but that was just kind of funny, you know? But over summer, things got very serious, very fast, when vampires ended up spending a few weeks in jail after being accused of a crime I cannot mention. You know what I mean? In fact, it got so bad in prison that they had to put him in solitary to protect him from the other guys, and there was so much worry that he could end up doing serious time for it that some sources claim that Arsene possibly bought Alexander Hleb to cover for him if he ended up being in prison for good. But regardless, the case ended up being dismissed, and somehow he still made it back in time for preseason. And it was around that moment that for some reason, before it was a good idea to approach Wenger and demand more playing time, as Van Persie himself recalled it, he looked me in the eyes and told me, "You're still not a top player." I asked him why, and he replied, "No, I'm not telling you. You have to find out for yourself. You have to start asking the right questions. Look around so many top players, and you're not one of them." Why are you not a top player, Robin? From that moment, I began paying attention. I'd look at Dennis, at Henry, at Pyers, the runs they made the way. They read the game. I realized that he was right. I was so far off, I told myself that's where I want to go. And I'm guessing the motivational talk works because by no member, Van Persie scored ace goals in 8 matches and had been named the player of the month, but that was precisely when his other big issue began to surface. Van Persie was pretty much made of glass. And when a player stepped on his foot a few matches later, he literally broke his toe. And to that, tree ankle sprains over the rest of the season. And yeah, his form died down massively by the time Arsenal made it to the Champions League final. He'd only played 8 minutes throughout the entire knockout stage. Then, of course, as his 3rd season began, we got another glimpse at his problematic side when a lost control of his BMW crashed it and literally just left it there, hitting a right to training like it was nothing, which, as you might imagine, is a crime, one that could get you up to 6 months in jail. Thankfully, his excuse that he didn't know somehow worked. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened? Regardless, that season, despite going through 3 more injuries, he managed to score even on Reese, somehow finishing as a club soft score and doing it in style, even scoring a goal against. Charlton at Wenger called the goal of a lifetime. And he living to, Barcelona over summer the day had arrived. It was time for Van Persie to put on his big boy pants and take over as the king of the Emirates. But again, after a streak of 7 goals in 10 matches, he went out for international duty, injured this knee, and spent 5 months on the sidelines. Even returned twice, but every time he stepped on the pitch, it was either his ankle or his knee. It seemed impossible for him to stay fit. The next season, thankfully, things weren't too bad. Only 4 minor knocks and 7 matches on the sidelines throughout the year, and the result was incredible. 20 goals, 14 assists, a spectacular goal versus Liverpool. He even lived the league's assist-providing shots and was named Player of the Season at Arsenal, but following year, it happened again. 16 goal contributions in the first 14 matches of the season, and then he got injured in an international friendly and was out till April. By the time you got another start, there were 3 matches left in the season. You have to realize that at this point, Van Persie was closing in on his 28th birthday. It was starting to be questioned if you'd ever be able to have a world-class season, but then a lot of things happened very quickly. First, despite the injury, Van Persie still made it to the World Cup and surprised everyone, playing a huge role in getting the Netherlands out of the group stage and then assessing one of the decisive semi-final goals secure their place in the biggest game on the planet. And though they lost, it didn't stop. Once back at Arsenal, it took on Bergkamp's number 10, and though he injured his ankle again before it even managed to score a single goal, by New Year's it was fully recovered. And then it went on a run that made every other player in the league look like an amateur. You see, on January 1st, Van Persie scored his first goal of the season. At that point, Berbatov was on top of the goal scorer stable, with Timon Tevez was second with 11, but only 7 matches later. Then Persie had already scored 10 goals himself, and though, just to stick to his brand, he then got injured in his 2 matches. He still came back, and even with Arsene Wenger disastrous form, he went on another run of 8 goals in 10 matches, even, breaking Drogba record for scoring in the most consecutive away games. By the end of the season, he had tied Ronaldo and Henry for the record of most goals ever scored in the second half of the season. But unfortunately, even if very impressive, regardless, it was still 2 goals away from stealing the Golden Boot from Berbatov and Tevez. Even more disappointing, he was on 26 goals and 6 assists in 25 matches across all competitions, and still did not make it any further than the run of 16 in the Champions League. And Arsenal not been completely robbed against Barcelona, with Van Persie being sent off for kicking the ball just 1 second after the referee had blown his whistle. Who knows what could have happened? After all, they were in the lead. Regardless, it didn't matter, because at 20 years of age, the next season will be the first since his arrival in the Premier League, where Robin Van Persie did not get injured a single time. Not even a minor knock. The moment Fabregas left the club, it took on the armband and just kept going. 21 goals in excess in the first half of the season by New Year's. He had been named in the FIFA World 11 for the first time in his career, and then we thought them seemingly running away. With the final Champions League spot, then Persie put his foot down and just kept scoring, even leading Arsenal to come back, win against Tottenham themselves as they eventually finished just 1 point above them. As one newspaper would put it, Van Persie was a one-man band of the highest order, in a season where he got within interest of beating every single goal-scoring record in sight. Arsenal's second highest goal scorer was Theo Walcott with a measly 8 goals. Even if his team had finished 19 points away from second place, when it came down to the voting, there was no doubt Robin Van Persie was a PFA Player of the Year. And as you might imagine, here's exactly where the whole betrayal took place. Once Robin Van Persie met with the board to negotiate his new contract, just like Fabregas, he asked him where the club's ambition had gone. What had happened since the early 2000s? What was the plan? In Aikido knots, they started showing him the club profit. Margins, the net, and gross whatever. It was obvious to him that their objectives were not the same as, he once said, my relationship to Arsenal was like a marriage. After 80 years we had grown apart, we were tired of each. Other, I was so ambitious. I still dreamed of winning the league titles. I began looking. Around that, his life. Honestly, as much as I understand, this is incredibly ironic, considering that Van Persie was known for having cheated on his wife. But moving on, when Van Persie arrived at Man United, there was a lot of doubt surrounding his signings. Some said Wayne Rooney name wouldn't bash well, some said United to their focus on improving their midfield. But Sir Alex clearly did not agree. Not only did they address that second claim saying that when a player of that caliber shows up, you have to act. There's no time to think, but there's also the fact that the moment he signed Van Persie, he went into the locker room, and according to real Ferdinand, and he told his players, Scholesy, Carrick, Shinji, Wayne, I got a new player. I'll show you how to get the ball to him, and if you can give him the ball, like that, he will win us the league. And if you can't, he will not play. His Ferdinand I had never seen him talk about a player like that. Ronaldo was probably the only other one. And thankfully for Van Persie, the entire club was convinced that this was possible. In fact, the assistant coach, René Meulenstein, even convinced him to take the number 20 shirt because that year it would take United to their 20th week title. And so he did. In fact, it was one of the most decisive performances in the history of football, and it started off at an absurd pace. After having already scored the decisive goal in first start for the club, the very next match, then Persie faced Southampton. And around 1 hour mark, United were trailing behind 2-1, with Van Persie having scored the one, obviously. However, then he missed a few chances and topped it all off by missing a penalty which greatly upset him. But with about 10 minutes left, his leg began cramping up and it was pretty severe. Most players would have signalled for substitution and gone on with her day, but when Persie refused to leave. And on the 87th minute, it tied the match. And in injury time, it completed a comeback and got his hat-trick. But still, when he walked into the dressing room with the ball, he asked for everyone's attention and apologized to his teammates for missing the penalty. That bloody entitled young boy was dead and gone. This new Van Persie was a professional, and he had a license to kill. A few matches later, he scored the winner versus Liverpool, then 3 assists and a goal over the next 3 matches. And once they beat both Arsenal and Chelsea back-to-back on minimal margin, Guest scored against both, 10 matches in. His goals that already won his team 13 points, but people didn't focus way too much on those first saying, because he didn't really stop. On his 11th match, he assisted the goal in a treat to a win, and then after 2 more quiet games, he went on another absurd run, scoring the winning goals in 3 consecutive games, finishing off with an injury time goal versus City, and then carrying on with 5 goals and 2 assists in the next 5 matches, and then adding 2 opening goals versus Tottenham and Liverpool. Now 23 matches into the season, he had won 24 points for his club with 24 goal contributions in 20 starts. And even if then he went on a dryers streak after colliding with a TV camera and injuring his hip, United were already 11 points ahead. The Carrick job was completed, but still he made sure to come back before the season ended, scoring maybe the coolest hat trick ever against Aston Villa. With his first goal, he made United champions. With his second, he literally won the award for goal of the season, and with his third, he leapt Frogwish Suarez to the top of the goal scorer's stable, allowing him to take the golden boot at the end of the season. As he said it himself, that whole season I felt relaxed and confident. We went behind in 16 different games and still won by 11 points. He want me to tell you? Why? Because Robin Van Persie was there. But of course we couldn't really get a happy ending then, sir. Alex surprised everyone by retiring. And according to Ferdinand, his retirement hurt Robin the most, that I even say he felt betrayed.